Today we're going to be making a tiered maxi skirt, which in my opinion is a closet staple. I've got an old bed sheet that I'm going to be using for this project, but in general would recommend a lightweight, breathable fabric, especially as we get into the warmer weather. Overall, the project is fairly simple, straightforward, and I would say beginner friendly. Bonus is no pattern is needed because we're going to figure out all the measurements together. As far as materials goes, all you're going to need is fabric, thread, and elastic. For the measurements, each tier is a rectangle and we're going to take it back to algebra with variables just so that you can plug in what's applicable. W is for your waist measurement, E is for the width of your elastic for the waistband, M is the gathering multiplier. The larger the multiplier, the more full the skirt will be. Just for reference, I ended up using 1.5 as my multiplier. And then lastly, SA for seam allowance. This example is for 3 tiers and you'll first want to determine how tall you want each tier to be, which can be equal or vary depending on your preference. Again, for reference, the top tier of my skirt was 10 inches, the second tier 14 inches, and the third tier 18 inches. Once all the heights are figured out, we're going to go through and add the seam allowances. For the top tier, we have to take into consideration the fabric needed to create the case for the elastic. So we're going to add the width of the elastic plus 1/2 inch to height 1, and then add seam allowance for the bottom. For the second tier, take height 2 plus 2 times seam allowance. And for the third tier, add seam allowance for the top and then 1 inch on the bottom for the hem. Now on to figuring out all the lengths of the tiers. For the top tier, take your waist measurement times the multiplier plus 2 times seam allowance. We're going to call the waist times multiplier A, and just make sure that A is greater than your hip measurement so that the skirt will fit comfortably. Now we're going to bring A down to the second tier times the multiplier plus 2 times seam allowance. We're going to call A times the multiplier B and bring it down to the third tier times the multiplier plus 2 times seam allowance. The hard part and all the math is done. We now have the measurements to cut all our pieces out and start sewing. I mentioned before that I'm using a bed sheet for this skirt and it has a hem, so I'm going to use that for my bottom tier. Once you've got all your pattern pieces cut out, starting with the top tier, match short edges, good sides together, and sew. Then overlock that seam to prevent the edges from fraying. Next, we're going to create the case for the elastic, so fold the top edge down 1/4 inch, then fold again 1.25 inches. This will hide the raw edge on the inside of the waistband for a clean finish, and sew around as close as you can to the bottom fold, remembering to leave a gap. Now grab a piece of elastic about 2 inches less than your waist measurement and feed it through the case we just created, then sew the ends together. Now we can sew the gap closed back at our machine by stretching the waistband flat. First tier down, now let's move to the second tier. Sew short ends, good sides together again, and overlock that edge. This is when we get into the gathering. Set the stitch length to the longest possible on your machine and sew 2 parallel lines within the seam allowance. Remember not to backstitch and leave long thread tails at the start and finish. To gather, grab the bobbin threads from the same end and start pulling until the length of the second tier matches the length of the bottom of the top tier. It may take some time to get relatively equal bunching all the way around, but once you're done, you can just tie off the ends to make sure the length stays the same when moving to the next step. After all that gathering, pin the bottom of the top tier to the top of the second tier, good sides together, and sew around. Remove the basting stitches and then overlock. Next, grab your third tier and repeat all of those steps. So, sew the short edges, good sides together, overlock, gather the top edge until the length matches the bottom of the second tier, pin good sides together, sew around, overlock. Now on to the final step, the hem. Although I get to skip this part because it was so nicely done for me, but all you need to do is double fold the bottom of the last tier and sew around. Then the skirt is complete, and here's how it looks.